Hi, everyone. This is Bruce Biewald from Synapse Energy Economics. You're online for our webinar on modeling ambitious state clean energy policies. So welcome. This is an experiment. We're going to try to dig a little deeper than usual into some of the analysis and modeling, we're looking for feedback, see how what you think about this. Is there a demand for webinars and discussions that go into some analytical details, modeling techniques, and so on? So let's start with logistics. We are going to record this, and so if you miss something, don't worry about taking notes. There'll be a recorded version available that we'll send out a link later. You are muted, and we're not planning to unmute you, but there's an email address that you can send any questions as we go along to, and we'll be fielding those questions as you send them. We've got 3 presenters, and we'll probably do a couple questions after each, and then some additional questions, kind of broader questions at the end. But please do send your questions to webinar@synapse-energy.com. Also, if you have any kind of technical issues, use the chat feature, and we'll try to get those resolved quickly. Who we are, we're Synapse, and we specialize in this kind of analytical modeling, deep dive on the electric system, energy, environmental issues. The agenda's fun. So this is, like I said, an experiment. There are a lot of conferences, a lot of meetings, webinars about policy and advocacy and so on. And the idea here is kind of similar to that, but this is the one where if you have questions about how the analysis was done, heat rate curves or forced outages, probabilistic modeling. How long does it take to run that model? Are there tricks or techniques to help manage inputs and outputs to actually do the analysis? A lot of times I think some of the more interesting, as I sit and listen to talk, some of the more interesting pieces are about the edges of an analysis. What about the system on the other side of the analytical boundary? How is that represented? Or maybe what about the period after the study period ends, and how are end effects and further things going further in time modeled? And in most contexts, if you ask a question like that, I think the room of lawyers or policymakers or advocates will kind of grind to a halt, or why did you ask that digressing type question? Here, those are welcome. So send them along. That's our bread and butter. So we plan to dig deep into 3. We're hoping to do this as a regular thing. We're committed to doing the next few months. Today is the 2nd Thursday, but we're aiming for 3rd Thursdays. So you can block them off on your calendar, or we'll email you and let you know. But we're looking for a month. We're planning to do a monthly dive into different topics related to energy and environmental analysis. So we hope there's a market for this. People are interested in engaging on these issues, and we sure are. We've got 3 specific topics today. One's dealing with California, some analysis of integrating large amounts of renewable energy in California, and Patrick Lukow is going to be talking about that. We're going to look at a Pennsylvania analysis that goes even further, 100% renewables, and what would that look like, and how can that be analyzed and understood in terms of cost and implications. And then third, we're going to look at a renewable portfolio standard analysis in Massachusetts, and let's dive right in. Patrick Lukow's first with the California.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. This is Patrick. I'm going to talk about a lot of the California work we've been doing. We've been doing detailed modeling work in California for quite some time now, and I think it's a good topic for this presentation because a number of different modeling tools have been used in California. We're going to focus on the long-term planning processes in the state, and different modeling tools have been used to look at what resource needs there are in the future and what the operational requirements of those needs would be given the state's ambitious policy goals, both in the form of renewable portfolio standards and caps on emissions. Our client for a lot of this work has been the Office of Ratepayer Advocates in California. I've got some key findings on this slide, but I'll cover these as we go. The major factors that we addressed were largely operational requirements as well as ultimate capacity requirements, and I'm going to focus on some of the key characteristics of the different models we've used. So just to set the scene a little bit, one of the things you'll see mentioned a lot in the context of the California electricity system is the impact that significant new renewable energy builds are having on the grid. And one of those major impacts is seen in the shape of the net load curve. This graph here is something that the Energy Information Administration put together not too long ago, just showing how the hourly load on a spring day that the California system has to meet has changed over the last 5 years. It used to be a system with afternoon or late afternoon peak, but it's steadily evolved into a system with late morning peak and then a second early evening peak. And that's largely a product of increasing solar penetration on the grid, both rooftop distributed solar as well as a number of very large-scale utility-sized plants. And that presents some challenges to the system. You have to be able to turn down conventional power plants as solar ramps up in the morning, and then rapidly turn on new resources at the end of the day as the sun goes down. Fortunately, it's a somewhat predictable cycle, so that helps, but there's still challenges with this big ramp up in generation. And one of the things I wanted to point out on the slide was that while the level of capacity here is on the order of 20 to 25 gigawatts, this is a spring day in March, and the overall capacity needs in California can be much higher than that. In a summer day, on a peak summer day, typical capacity needs are upwards of 46 gigawatts. So there's a lot of capacity on the system to meet those needs that can still provide some of those ramping needs in these spring days. On to the next one. So this next chart just shows hourly renewable energy generation on a record-setting day this spring where renewable energy met significant levels of load, 42% of demand over the course of the day and up to 72% at the peak hour. I think the important point here is that a lot of this data is very helpful as we set up and calibrate our models, and looking at the hourly production as provided by the California ISO or other similar organizations across the country is always very helpful to understand how the system should work. And this is a day where California was able to balance these fluctuations and meet the system needs without major reliability considerations. So next I'll move on to some of the modeling challenges we've talked about. So a lot of the modeling we've done in California has historically been with the Plexos tool developed by Energy Exemplar. This is a very detailed model with all the power plants in California. We model all 8760 hours of the year. The model we used in this context actually had all of the power plants for the entire WEC, but all of the states in the West. So it was a very detailed model that had some challenges associated with it. Model runs took a long time. I think a typical run for a single month in 2024 for this project took on the order of 8 hours. So that was a significant constraint. But that gave us a lot of detail to understand how in this future year where California is set out to meet, at this point it was just a 33% RPS standard. how will renewable energy be balanced? Will there be enough renewable energy and conventional capacity on the grid to meet peak days? Will there be enough flexible capacity? All of those things were on the table to be addressed in this study. This graph here shows the headroom in all hours of the year. Headroom is a metric to demonstrate how much extra capacity that's not being used is available at any given time to meet fluctuations in demand or upcoming ramping needs to serve load. And what you can see here is there's a couple hours in late July, I think, where headroom dipped really low. This run didn't have all of the potential new capacity builds that were anticipated at that time. But for much of the remainder of the year, there was quite a bit of headroom on the system, and that varied with both fluctuation in resources, whether that's solar or wind or hydro or conventional plants out on maintenance, but also seasonal demand shapes. So let's go to the next slide. This focuses in on one specific day to highlight some of the operational challenges that models like this are great at addressing. This graph shows hourly generation from a number of different resource types as compared to net load. This is primarily conventional generation, so rather than having solar explicitly on this chart, it's factored into the blue line here, which is the load net of wind and solar. And what you can see happen is the net load on this spring day drops very low, well below 5,000 megawatts, and resources have to drop to balance that need at the same time. A lot of that flexibility was met by a change in the net imports into California. And because the system saw this need happening, there weren't a lot of other flexible resources on the system at that time. It was primarily these imports that adjusted their output. And then towards the end of the day, the imports ramped up again, as well as more generation from some hydro, but largely gas combined cycles, storage units, both pump storage and battery storage. But there was some curtailment during the middle of the day, and that's largely a product of these three bars you see that aren't very flexible on this chart. You have the gray contribution from nuclear, the orange CHP contribution, and then the light blue hydro contribution. Some of that will be different today. This run still had Diablo Canyon in it, which has been announced to be retired. Nuclear is typically seen as not a very flexible resource, just operating at a very standard profile. And that presents some challenges when you're dealing with resources that fluctuate a lot during the day. There are a number of incremental steps that can be taken to improve this behavior and reduce this level of curtailment that you're seeing on those days. I have a list of those on the next slide that I'll just walk through quickly. And I would say California, in their planning processes, are addressing all of these items, which range from time of use rate making, using different rates for customers at different times of the day to discourage demand at the highest peak hours and encourage demand when electricity is really cheap. Maybe those middle of the day hours where there's a lot of solar energy on the system. Targeted energy efficiency towards those periods where demand is the highest. Storage is obviously a very valuable resource, whether that's the existing hydro pump storage resource or new batteries, which have come online rapidly over the last year. Electrification is a great source for dealing with this that was considered in a very limited fashion in this earlier study we did. Electric vehicles, particularly with charging at different hours that you could control or influence through the use of something like time of use rates. Curtailment is something I wanted to mention. A little curtailment of renewable energy resources isn't necessarily the end of the world. There might only be a few days of the year where you have significant constraints along these lines, and being able to curtail some of those resources on those needs might provide a lower cost overall solution. And then things like increasing thermal flexibility, whether that's through retirements of nuclear plants or through new gas plants that are much more flexible than the plants that were installed 20 years ago. And then something that California has been working on quite a bit is enhanced regional flexibility, so working with neighboring states to share electricity when California has too much, or consume electricity from the neighbors when there's not enough. That collaboration doesn't take a lot of new hardware. It takes a lot of process changes and coordination, but once you get there, the benefits that have been seen from the first iteration of this, which has been called the energy imbalance market, have been pretty dramatic and pretty rapid. So my last slide, I just wanted to touch on the latest California planning process. With the advent of SB 350, which was the bill that increased the RPS in California from 33% to 50% in 2030, there was also a mandate for an integrated resource plan. And that's just in the early steps, but I wanted to pull out some of the results of that. This is a statewide resource planning process where a model is used to consider what new power plants are added and what's retired over the next 15 or so years in order to meet these policies at the lowest cost. This is a longer-term model than the Plecos model I was talking about before. This is a tool that was developed by E3 called Resolve, and it focuses on a few key years over the future time period, has less unit-specific resolution, but is able to consider some of these balancing challenges at the same time as considering whether it's more economic to build more solar plants, build more wind, build more gas plants, and in a much finer level of detail than other models in the same category. And I think thinking about those two modeling frameworks is important. They're both very important and valuable in this discussion and serve different needs. So I think there's a lot of context where tools like Plecos and tools like Resolve can be used either in parallel or in sequence one after another to really get to some of these challenges with ambitious policy scenarios.
Thanks, Patrick. We have a question about, you mentioned imports and the expanded footprint as helping with the balancing in low load situations. With the imports and exports, can you comment on the fuel type makeup? I mean, nuclear and hydro, how do you think about, do we know what they are and how do we understand that?
Sometimes you know what they are, sometimes you don't. Some resources will specifically self-schedule into the CAISO market. Sometimes that can present a real challenge when resources say, we just want to participate, we'll take whatever price you give us, because that makes them a lot less flexible. The California climate policies attribute generic emissions rates to some imports, but if you can meet a certain standard of specificity, you can get a lower emissions rate. It really is a mix, and I think an important component to that is also the exports. The exports are also a mix, but the exports to the broader region can serve to lower costs both for California as well as all of the neighboring states in some of those hours where electricity prices are quite low.
Thanks. You spoke a little bit about how the two models can be used in a complementary way, where one model is hourly and can analyze questions about the more detailed dispatch and ramping and so on, and the other model being more kind of long-term capacity optimization but less detail. The question is whether is hourly level of detail enough? Are there times when you need even finer time resolution to answer the questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hourly is enough for a lot of studies, but there's been an increasing focus on thinking about some of those hours where you really have to think about every minute, every 5 minutes, maybe every 15 minutes, And a lot of the models that are out there today can do that. It presents a lot of challenges in both getting the data to set that up as well as the computational capacity to run that. I mentioned this model we ran took about 8 hours for a month. So if you wanted to quadruple the resolution by doing 15 minutes, it would take a lot longer to run. What they did in this study was do another model before Plexos to generate a reserve requirement of what level of resources would need to be online to meet some of those intra-hour fluctuations. And I think that worked out pretty well.
Great. So let's move on to the second chunk of today's webinar about Pennsylvania. The Delaware Riverkeeper Network asked us about 100% renewable Pennsylvania. What would that look like? So can you tell us about that, please, Pat Knight?
Hi, everybody. This is Pat Knight, and like Bruce said, I'm going to be spending the next couple minutes talking about a project we worked on last year for Delaware Riverkeeper Network. In this project, Synapse partnered with EQ Research to look at a set of policies that would result in a zero CO2 emissions future for Pennsylvania consumers by 2050. And when we say zero CO2 emissions in this context, we're not talking about just the electric sector, but we're also talking about the other sectors, transportation, buildings, and the industrial sectors as well. Just to give a broad overview of this project, within the context of the project, we looked at different plans for widespread electrification. We examined increased investment in renewables, and we also looked at strategies that could be used to improve the level of energy efficiency above and beyond what's being done today, and what could be done, or what is likely to be done in a business as usual or reference case feature. Another goal of this project was not only to develop a clean energy future for Pennsylvania, but also to sort of create a paradigm or a model that could be used or applied in other states around the country. And I'll just briefly go over the findings. You can, of course, read the report if you'd like to know more about this, but we found that the 100% renewables scenario could achieve significant cost savings over the entire study period, could result in $9 billion in bill savings in a single year, and over the entire time period of 2015 through 2050, result in a net increase of nearly 500,000 jobs. So this here is a chart that shows the historical sources of energy in Pennsylvania since 1990 through about 2015, as well as the future sources of energy as they were modeled in this analysis. Again, this chart includes energy from all sectors, so not just the electric sector, but also transportation and buildings and industrial. Compared to that reference case up there on the blue line, in our policy case, the red line, we relied extensively on electrification, energy efficiency, and both in-state and out-of-state renewables to phase out fossil and nuclear energy through 2050. Two quick things to note. Within the context of this project, we used modeling to build the lowest cost renewables that could be delivered to Pennsylvania. So what this meant is about 1/4 of the renewables were built in Pennsylvania itself, and the other 3/4 were built in neighboring states. So this means that you would have situations where, say, a wind plant or a solar plant was built just over the border in Ohio or West Virginia, for example, and then directly transmitted it into the region. The other point I want to draw attention to here is the yellow slice at the top of the chart. And that's not just sort of energy efficiency as we traditionally think about it, but also the energy efficiency inherent in electrification. As I'm sure many people on the phone know, the current uses of energy, both for generating power from natural gas or coal plants, or from generating power in your car from gasoline, waste a tremendous amount of energy on heat. And one of the most interesting findings from this analysis was just how much energy could be saved by transferring those end uses over to the electric sector. So you're probably wondering how we were able to get to all these conclusions. And what we've done here is make up a table showing the flow of the modeling tools used in this project. Like many of the work that goes on at Synapse, this project required the interaction of a lot of different types of modeling software. So just to talk about each one individually for a moment, at the beginning of our project, like we do for many projects, we developed sort of a high-level view of the problem or the issue at hand using a simple spreadsheet model. And this model is also used to help us track things like known new unit additions and known retirements, things like sales forecasts, inclusive of energy efficiency, thinking about other variables like natural gas prices and resource costs. And what happens in this step is a lot of this information gets translated into inputs for the next step. And in this particular project, our next step involves using the REEDS model. REEDS, in case you're not familiar with it, is a capacity expansion model developed by the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. And REEDS contains a fantastic amount of information on renewable energy potentials, costs, and technology changes or curves over time. Synapse has adapted the sort of out-of-the-box version of REEDS to allow us to have finer control over certain variables like state-specific energy efficiency. And we've also adapted REEDS to better talk to the other types of software that we use all the time in our modeling projects. In this particular project for Pennsylvania, we use REEDS to model the entire U.S. system from today through 2050. Using its cost optimization algorithms, REEDS solved for the lowest cost electricity system that reliably supplied electricity, but also met all the other constraints that we were imposing on the system, like sales forecasts, resource costs, and of course the requirement for Pennsylvania's electricity to be supplied entirely through renewables. So at the same time we use REEDS, we're also using another model, our own MSEM model. MSEM is the multi-sector emissions model. It's a spreadsheet-based platform used to track emissions and energy use from all sectors of the economy from 1990 through 2050. And it's based on publicly available EIA data, as well as a whole host of information that Synapse has researched and aggregated into a single platform. So for this particular analysis, we used the MSEM model to estimate emissions and electricity impacts of electrifying transportation, electrifying heating load, and industrial end uses, and thinking about how all those different sectors sort of get rolled up into the electric sector and how it could increase sales, which then sort of feeds into REEDS and is a bit of an interesting circular loop there. The last big model we used in this project was the IMPLAN model. IMPLAN is a industry standard input-output job impact model, and it estimates the direct, indirect, and induced impacts of implementing different policy decisions. So it essentially estimates the net job changes associated with the delta between two scenarios. So what's the difference between doing a reference case or your 100% policy case, and how does that translate to jobs? IMPLAN comes with a lot of great detail on different sectors, but some sparser detail on other sectors. And unfortunately, for us, the out-of-the-box version of IMPLAN doesn't have a whole lot of detail on the power generation sector. So this is an area that Synapse has really rolled up its sleeves and added a lot more information. So with our additions to IMPLAN, we can get a really good handle on the job impacts of, say, increasing the amount of energy efficiency and renewables, and the job impacts that are associated with decreasing the usage of coal or natural gas, which is especially important in a state like Pennsylvania, which is a producing state and produces a lot of fossil fuels. In all of the different models, there was one important thing that I want to talk about, the key feature that I've got at the bottom, where we're thinking about both the reference case and a policy case. And this is really important because while it's good to compare your policy case results to the sort of status quo today or what's happening in today's world, we know that the future, no matter what happens, is going to be very different. So in this particular project, especially since we're getting to 100% renewables, but also in many of our other projects, it's really important to not only think critically about what your policy case is going to be made up of, but also what you think is going to happen sort of no matter what, and use that as a comparison point for the main goals of your study.
Thanks, Pat. So one question, actually, let me tell the people on the phone on the webinar can ask questions, like we said, to webinar@synapse-energy.com, and you can post questions for prior presenters, and we'll come back at the end for any of that. So, Pat, this is, compared to the California analysis that we were just talking about, this is a lot of renewables. So this is, 100% renewable, and not just in the electric sector. I mean, how do you go about creating a scenario I mean, it's such a change from today's conditions. How do you think about creating a scenario that will meet that constraint?
Sure. So I think maybe there's two related answers to that. So first, a lot of what we broke new ground on this project with was looking into the non-electric sectors, thinking hard about what sort of end uses are easily translated over to the electric sector, and which ones would you wait until, say, the late 2030s or something. So to give an example, it's really easy to think about a pathway to electrify regular light-duty vehicles today, but thinking bigger picture about certain types of industrial uses require you to go outside the box and really do a lot of research in terms of what could be technically feasible now versus a couple of years from now. I think the other point that I want to make is goes back to what Patrick was saying earlier about the rules of different models. REEDS is this great platform for exploring different features that really go heavy on renewables. NREL has done an awesome job integrating all sorts of information on their GIS maps and technology resource curves, and in a lot of ways, it sort of is the optimal platform to think about really deep renewable futures. But the downside is because REEDS focuses on this broad renewable concept, the trade-off in order to get a run that finishes in a reasonable amount of time, it has to go a little bit lighter on the temporal detail. So this could be an area, I think, to explore in future projects, thinking not just about sort of the big picture 100% renewables and having a model that can solve for a reliable system, but really getting into some of the key hours where, say, there's a lot of electricity getting transferred in or out of a region like Pennsylvania, and thinking about how that looks.
Great. Thanks, Pat. So let's move on to our the third chunk of this of today's festivities on Massachusetts and the RPS analysis in Massachusetts. Ariel Horowitz, take it away.
Good afternoon. My name is Ariel Horowitz, and I'm going to talk about our work on modeling the Massachusetts Renewable Portfolio Standard. This is a project that we did in partnership with Sustainable Energy Advantage, which I'm going to be abbreviating as SEA. And the goal of the project was to evaluate the impact of increasing the annual megawatt-hour targets or percentage of sales targets associated with the Massachusetts Class 1 RPS, especially in light of our current procurement policies. This project was conducted on behalf of the New England Clean Energy Center in partnership with Mass Energy Consumers Alliance. So our key findings from this report were really that in a base case, without any change to Massachusetts' current RPS policies, we found, somewhat to our surprise, that the RPS will likely cease being a driver of new renewables in the near future. We found that increasing the RPS from 1% to 2% per year would only have the impact of bringing the supply and demand of renewables into balance. And just to go into that a little bit, the driver behind that we found was really both about what we expect electricity sales in the future to be, given regional trends, especially Massachusetts' first in the nation accomplishments in energy efficiency, and also our use of procurement-based policies, or policies that increase the supply of renewable energy directly, as opposed to simply increasing the demand for renewable energy. So the impact of both of those trends meant that we found that the state needs to at least increase the RPS to a 2% per year target to bring that supply of renewables and the demand for renewables into balance and make the RPS really a driver of renewables in the region. We found that increasing the RPS beyond 2% would potentially drive an increase in renewables from about 2 gigawatts of new capacity to over 4 gigawatts of new capacity by 2030. We found that this would reduce the wholesale cost of electricity by about 3% and lead to an increase in jobs in the New England economy of about 37,000 jobs. We also found that this increase in the RPS would lower regional carbon emissions by an additional 6% as compared to a future in which we do not increase our RPS targets, and it would result in only minimal increases to monthly bills of about $2 per month on average. So in this chart, you can see what we forecasted the New England energy generation mix to be in our reference case in which the RPS policy targets are not increased. We created this, we modeled this data using a tool called Encompass, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. Encompass is a utility-grade, unit-specific model as opposed to REEDS, which is a little bit more generalized, as Pat was discussing. And what we found was that these recently enacted supply-side policies, these procurement targets, produce a sufficiently large increase in renewables in the business-as-usual case that the RPS policy no longer acts as a market-based driver of new renewable generation. So you can see there that even in the base case where we don't increase the renewable targets, our regional reliance on fossil fuels goes down, especially when we model some of the hydro and new Class 1 renewables targets coming online in the early 2020s. So as Pat did, I'll go through a little bit of the modeling structure that we used for this project. Similar to our Pennsylvania study, we passed data back and forth between a variety of different models here. The first step was to do some spreadsheet-based pre-processing, and that was to develop known unit additions and retirements, to figure out what we thought demand for electricity would be over the coming years, to forecast natural gas prices, resource costs, and other region-specific inputs, such as what we think is going to happen in response to the recent establishment of energy storage procurement targets. And this is a data set that was based on one originally developed by Anchor Power Solutions, the company that makes the Encompass model, and that we've since made a variety of in-house modifications and additions to. We performed this project internally. We think of it almost as a follow-up to a project that we did several months before, looking at the need for new gas pipeline capacity in the region, which was also modeling the New England electric sector. And one of the benefits of using these tools is that we've become very intimately familiar with this data set and have been able to sort of iteratively modify it over time. So once we established what our input parameters were going to be, we used the Encompass model in concert with our collaborators, SEA, who have an in-house model to forecast new renewable additions, specifically generation of Class 1 RECs. And we found that these two models worked really well together. We were able to use the renewable capacities and generation forecasted by SEA and model them in detail, in hourly detail, as a part of the New England electric sector using Encompass. Encompass uses linear optimization to solve for the least cost way to both add and dispatch resources in the region, given the set of constraints that we developed in the first step. We also took costs, wholesale market costs, fuel costs, and emissions results from Encompass and used that in the last step that I'll talk about in a second. Similarly, we took this build information and fed it into IMPLAN in a similar schema as Pat talked about for Pennsylvania, determining the net job impact of changing from one set of resources in the electric sector to another. This is a delta-based model, so we were only looking at differences in the build profiles between these various scenarios. And this accounts for both differences in capital spending and in operating costs. So the difference there that one can think about is that it takes generally more people on a day-by-day basis to make sure that a nuclear plant is running safely and effectively as compared to a field of solar panels. But we would plan to be building many more solar panels, spending more capital dollars on those solar panels than on new nuclear in New England in the next 20 years. And then finally, we also use these differentials between scenarios to understand the incremental costs of pursuing increases in the RPS. And we did this by taking the wholesale market energy and capacity costs that are forecasted by Encompass and translating those into average residential monthly electricity bill impacts in a spreadsheet model that we built in-house. And recently, we've been exploring ways to do that calculation for other rate classes as well, and making that really a comprehensive view of taking the costs on the ISO New England wholesale market and translating them out into what individual consumers see on their bills. So a key feature of this modeling design is that we modeled a wide variety of different scenarios and sensitivities. We modeled both gas prices and load and changes in those market conditions. And the goal, and we're pleased to be able to do this, was to provide nuanced answers for policymakers about what the risks and benefits would be of pursuing these policy paths over time.
Thanks, Aria. So one question about the New England analysis has to do with RGGI. And so how does the RPS interact with RGGI? And what do we assume? How do we model RGGI? And if RGGI is working as intended, why do we need an RPS to promote renewables?
Sure. So those are two fairly different questions embedded into a single question. There's a mechanistic question there about how did we approach RGGI in this modeling, which I'll address first. The answer to that is that we treated RGGI as a set price going forward as applied to the applicable resources in New England. The reason that we did that, instead of modeling it as a cap and trade program, which is what it actually is that RGGI impacts not just the states in the ISO New England territory, but also other states such as New England and states in the Mid-Atlantic. We were not modeling those other non-New England states on a unit-specific basis, and therefore we did not think that modeling this as a cap and trade structure, which Encompass can do, and we have done before, was going to accurately capture the dynamics in that market for allowances. Therefore, especially since there has been a lot of modeling on RGGI prices going forward from the RGGI study group itself, we thought it would be better to take a reasonable guess at what RGGI prices would end up being given these changes, even given these changes in the Massachusetts policy environment. As to your second question, I would say that carbon policy and renewable policy are not exactly the same thing and don't exactly serve the same goals. Renewable policies can have a different impact on your resource mix in terms of, like, if you apply a carbon price, certainly you're making a non-emitting resource seem cheaper as compared to an emitting resource, but you're doing that based on the extent to which those resources emit. So for example, a coal plant is going to see a higher effective price per megawatt hour than a gas plant. For a renewable policy, by contrast, you have a more granular control over which resources get sort of which level of participation in that policy and why. And that can drive different sorts of changes in the market. I think they can work in concert. It just depends on the goals of the policymakers in question.
Thanks, Ariel. I have a couple of questions for Patrick, going back to the California analysis. One is about curtailment. You mentioned curtailments being limited, Patrick, and the question is, are there studies that support that, and are there, if there is going to be curtailment, then contracts have to deal with that, right? So could there be price impacts and maybe litigation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Curtailment is definitely a big issue that has been studied in a lot of modeling processes. California is not only a national leader in ambitious clean energy policies, but they're also leading in terms of reasonable and thoughtful analysis about the impacts of challenges like this. And I think curtailment was an output that was considered on both of the studies I talked about, as well as a number of other studies. There's a non-trivial amount of curtailment happening today, particularly in the spring months. And I think that the inputs to these studies are, I would say they're evolving as we go and get a better understanding of the best ways to manage these challenges. The latest studies allow more net exports from California, which is a big factor in reducing the amount of curtailment in those days with the highest amount of solar and the lowest amount of loads that can really impact the amount of curtailment. I think it's a major issue, but there's a lot of options to deal with it, and I can confidently say that they're all on the table, and the state is thinking about the best way to implement them. As far as contracting goes, that is important. It's important to consider. From my perspective, that's been an interesting challenge in setting up the models to properly reflect how some of these resources will curtail their output, and I think that's an important consideration when you're thinking about these issues.
So here's a question for all of the presenters, but let's start with Patrick about basically air quality, and I think the answer probably differs for different models, but it is, gets to kind of, is there generator level emissions data, the input assumptions and the results that would allow one to model air quality impacts? So we got some base case, you got a policy scenario, maybe more than one policy scenario, and could these same models and analyses be used to drive the air quality analysis?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it and let Ariel and Pat chime in. I think it depends on the model a lot. Some models are really good at the specific pollutants that contribute to air quality issues, and others struggle a little bit more. I think one of the big contributors is the ramping and the starts and stops of a lot of the fossil units. And a detailed 8760-hour model like Plexos will do a much better job of that than a long-term capacity expansion model. And then there are a whole host of other models outside of our electricity system planning and operational models that really get to how those pollutants affect your air quality.
So I think this is another variation on the theme of models working in concert with each other. So none of the models that we talked about today talk about sort of air quality by itself. So you might have these models, I think all of them, yield results about the number of emissions that come out of a particular plant stack or maybe a collection of similar plants together. But what it doesn't get at is how those pollutants are then dispersed over a wider area, and then there's another layer on top of that, thinking about how that air dispersion then affects health impacts. So you could sort of think about, a hypothetical project where you use perhaps Encompass to figure out emissions, put those outputs into an air dispersion model, and then take the outputs from the air dispersion model and float it into a health impacts model to sort of work your way down the chain and really understand what the human impacts of these power plants are.
I'll say that usually the information that you need to know for that is how, as sort of as Patrick was saying, how many emissions occurred, when did they occur, and where did they occur, and you need to have sufficient confidence in the first answer and sufficient granularity on the latter two answers. And the granularity that's required depends on different models. Some air quality models are on a county basis, but some actually will take very specific point source sort of lat-long coordinates. And so depending on what level of granularity you need for your inputs, that might be, to such an air quality model, that might be a guiding factor in figuring out what detail of electric sector model you need to produce your emissions data.
Thanks. So another question kind of across the models, across the project has to do with kind of how we select what model to use, or, how did you think about that? And, we talked about kind of level of detail and what the model focuses on. Sometimes there are pragmatic things around cost and availability and kind of practical considerations beyond. But we've touched on, just focusing on the electric sector models for the moment. We've got talked about Plexus, Resolve, Reeds, and Encompass. And I guess my question for each of you is, how did you decide which model to use? Would the other models have been just as good? I mean, they're not interchangeable entirely, but how do you think about that? And could you have used other models? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the presentation I gave is the easiest answer to that, and then I'll let Pat and Ariel give the more complicated answer. But in California, we use the model the system planners were using, which has some benefits and it has some costs. Plexus was the model that the California ISO was using, and I think by adjusting just the inputs that we wanted to think about, we were able to provide a very direct comparison without a lot of uncertainty about if the model structure or the model resolution is affecting the results rather than the inputs we were changing. But some of these models are expensive, and some of these models, when we're using them for the first time, if we don't have a lot of experience, we have to spend some time really getting to understand it and calibrate the results and make sure there's something we can stand behind as well. So there's challenges with that too.
I think in terms of the other projects we're discussing, a lot of the time we want to use a utility grade model like Encompass in situations where that utilities themselves are part of our intended audience, or people who really care about what the utility response is going to be. In particular, because we know that utilities and electric system planners like ICE in New England think about the system on a unit-specific basis and really care about sort of operational constraints. One of the benefits of using a model like Encompass is that it gets very, very specific about which units are running when, why, what are the costs. It does a good job of forecasting the costs associated with the wholesale market. One of the things that we might think about in terms of the trade-offs between Encompass and Reeds in particular is that Encompass is very flexible, but it demands a lot of the user in terms of the inputs. Whereas Reed sort of comes equipped with how much renewable energy, where, and at what cost NREL thinks exists. And that's a major benefit of using it for the sort of 100% renewable studies that Pat was discussing. And that's a very valuable data set that utility grade models tend to sort of leave to the discretion of the user.
Thanks for that answer and all of the answers and the presentations. We're getting to the end of the hour, so I'm going to wrap it up by saying thanks to everyone, and especially you folks on the phone who sent questions. That helps us feel like we're actually engaging in a conversation. So we appreciate that. If we didn't get to your questions, I know there's some we did not get to, we may email you or follow up in some way. And like I said, we are committed to doing several more of these on a roughly monthly schedule. So if you have, and we have some ideas of topics, but if you have specific or general topic ideas that you'd be interested in, send them along. We have not settled on our topics and presenters yet. Also, today we've had 3 people from Synapse presenting, but we're open to broadening that out, including people from outside of our organization. Who, we like to collaborate and work with others. And so I hope that this has been interesting, and you will hear more from us in the future. We are committed to informing decisions, resource planning decisions, policy decisions with facts and data and rigorous analysis. If you are too, then join us.